Okay, so now we are going to start the part 4, which is going to be about retrieval and instantiations. And what is this? So how these processes are happening and what do they mean in our life? First of all, what is a schema? Turn on your video and tell me what do you know about a schema or a schemata or things related to that. How do you define a schema? And we already have lots of psychologists here. I mean, I'm sure that those who are psychologists, they can talk about the schemas for hours. Mariam, do you want to kind of talk about the schemas?
I believe a schema is something core belief that our about life, belief about life, other people, how to behave, how should we behave in with other people. It's core belief that we behave based on them, I think.
Okay. Atifa, do you want to add anything to that?
I think it's a cognitive framework. It helps us to have a shortcut for interpretation that we have about all the experience around us.
I'm just going to kind of put some others on a spotlight and ask them questions about that. Masood Rahmani, could you talk about the schemas?
Oh, well, schema or schema therapy. So I know it in sense of psychotherapy. It's a school of psychotherapy that came after CBT, which they define schema a bit deeper than a core belief, which is shaped in childhood. But for example, parental style has a rule, and there are some other stuff, even genetic. It could be mixed by genetic. All in all, it's a cognitive framework which is really strong, and it's really difficult to change. Even they believe we cannot change, just we can be aware of it.
Good. Panyan, as a last one, what do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, so I think everybody said enough, but the thing is simply, or basically we can say that schemas are like mental shortcuts, the mental representations of different things that lets us to categorize different things such as objects, people, events into different categories. So as far as I know, they are like object schemas, person schemas, or like, for example, like the example that one of our friends told about a cat, that we can, if we have a mental representation of animals and cats, we can categorize different creatures that look like a cat into that specific category. So yeah, so they I think they serve a role as mental shortcuts that let us to just categorize different things, events, and people into different, different categories.
That is good. And I can see in the chat space, people are discussing about, okay, there are different developmental aspects to the schemas. And you know that, probably one of the first people who was talking about schemas was Piaget, in terms of the developmental kind of milestones, how the schemas are being happening then. And we have, Masood was discussing about the schema therapy. So there are kind of different aspects about schemas. But let me just kind of give you kind of a few other kind of definitions. If you just check Wikipedia, you can see it just describes a pattern of thoughts. So it is talking about a pattern that basically organize different categories of information and the relationship. Okay, so this is the process that is happening in terms of, let's say we have a pattern that organize different categories and how they are related to each other in terms of the information. And you can imagine that what we are talking about, a schema, is a sort of memory framework. When we talk about memory schemas, there are large-scale knowledge that help us to decode scenes around pre-existing information to determine how and what we will be kind of in a given kind of situation we will be able to perceive from the environment. And it is also about, it's going to be more abstract than just episodic memories or larger than semantic memory. So it is something like a superordinate to the semantic memory. So when we talk, let's say, from episodic memories to semantic memories. Semantic memories could also be abstract, but when we go to a higher level of semantic memories that would be more pervasive and would be more, let's say, comprehensive, we call them schemas. And then, as you can imagine, that could be another, let's say, frame for understanding or perceiving the environment based on the information that we have from before. Examples, there are many examples, things like word views that we have. Even the stereotypes could be a type of schema, so some specific social roles. There are many kind of other examples, even in terms of what are the kind of abnormal schemas that we might have that are contributing to different psychiatric disorders and different mood and anxiety disorders, and how people might be able to change that. And even in terms of the personality, what type of things that are the schemas that are contributing to different personality disorders. But let's go back to let's say cognitive neuroscience and trying to understand what we have been discussing about a schema in the context of what we are discussing about today in terms of the memory and mental representations. So what we have been discussing about a specific neocortical representation of a specific episode. So we discussed that each specific episode would be represented in a sort of kind of neocortical map of different items that are related to each other. People have schemas that serve as templates, and especially if that specific episode would be to some extent related to a specific schemas, they could just activate those schemas and they would be perceived as a part of that, let's say, pathway. So it could be even reshaped to a shape that is close to the schema that we have. And the interesting part is that, as you can see here, there is no connection between these 2 points in that specific episodic experience that we had. But as there is a connection here, over the time, when you perceive that episode, those connections would be happening in the what we call the gist extraction from the memory. So the memory that you perceive from the environment, the final conclusion would be able to have that specific connection. So we call that a schema accommodation. So we accommodate the experience that we had in the template of the schema to a new experience that is accommodated. So we have kind of a sort of accommodation in the process. And that is going to kind of shape how we understand things in the environment outside us. Meanwhile, we know that this specific, let's say, memory representation could be activated with these cues. So any cue in the environment that could activate that specific, let's say, schema that is a sort of memory that helps us to understand what is happening in the kind of outside environment. And that is the way that even when we talk things like stereotypes, these processes are happening. And when we talk about a stereotype, let's say, these specific stereotypes that sometimes we have, these, let's say, sometimes we call them implicit. Sometimes they are implicit, sometimes they could be also explicit in terms of, okay, when we talk about, let's say, we might have gender as a stereotype. When we talk about ladies, we have a specific, let's say, schemas from ladies in our mind. And when we are exposed to a kind of an experience that is related to a specific lady, we might kind of connect the dots in a way that our stereotype is shaping that experience. And we might have specific memories that are not really there on that episode, but based on that schema, our memory is going to be reshaped. So this is going to be a kind of important part in terms of how schemas are going to mediate the memories that we are shaping from the experience that we have. So there is always a kind of filter between the experience that we make and the memories that we make from the experience. So the memory could be shaped, but schemas that we have, schemas that we have in our brain. So that is going to be an important part of the process of making memories. So it is going to be important in terms of we really do not reflect as whatever we are experiencing in the environment outside as a new memory that we are making, okay? And then it's also going to be important to know that those representational maps that we discussed could be represented in different levels. So we discussed that those maps could be in hippocampus. Those maps could be in different parts of the brain, representing different aspects of those, let's say, memories that are going to be recorded in different neocortical areas. And based on the area that we have these representations, they could have different sort of content or different characteristics in terms of, okay, are they representing more, let's say, in the space of, let's say, auditory modality, or they are, let's say, more conceptual, or as you can see here in the kind of the retrosplenial kind of lobe, we call that PCC, posterior cingulate cortex. This part could be related to something like self-related processes. So these maps could be happening in many different parts of the brain, not only in hippocampus, but also in other parts of the brain. And it seems that there is a significant role for VMPFC to modulate which map is going to be activated and how these maps are going to be activated and interacting to each other. So there is going to be a significant role for VMPFC. And so these maps are not, only within hippocampus. They could be in different parts of the brain. And in each part of the brain, they could have different sort of, let's say, essence, or they could have different types of content, or they could be specific to that specific part of the brain, whether they are going to have a specific auditory memories, they are going to have a specific visual memories, or a specific, let's say, conceptual memories. All these parts could be represented together and then could be connected to each other as well inside the brain, okay? So that is another level of this, let's say, retrieval. So when we talk about retrieval process and how these pieces are going to activate these maps, these activations could be happening in different parts of the brain. That is the reason that when we have, let's say, exposure to the cues, if the cue is going to be significant, most of the time we have activations in both hippocampus, in the retrosplenial parts, areas in temporal cortex, because those cues could activate those maps in different parts of the brain. And if the cue, let's say, when we talk about drug-related cues compared to neutral cues, if they have the same conceptual level, sometimes when we compare them to each other, you do not have a significant activation in the temporal area because conceptually they are in the same level. But most of the time you have higher activations here in the retrosplenial part because those cues would have more content, drug-related cues have more content regarding the self. So people have stronger activations related to self in their memories compared to neutral cues that could not have that level of, let's say, personal representation. And that's the reason that we have these maps activated in a stronger way compared to the maps that we have in other parts of the cortex. The other piece about this, let's say, retrieval process, how these things are being retrieved and how these cortical maps are working together. As we discussed about before, this is hippocampus, this is neocortex. We discussed about how we have maps in hippocampus, how we have maps in neocortex. And as I told you, let's say we have a specific experience of recently kind of forgetting your phone in a taxi cab, okay? So these two parts could be connected to each other, okay? And then previously, something like 2 weeks ago, you had an experience of taking a cab because you have a really heavy luggage and you cannot take your luggage with yourself into, let's say, public transport and into tram or into, let's say, metro. So you had to take a cab to have your heavy luggage to the airport. So your heavy luggage is also connected to the concept of taxi. As you can see here, your, let's say, suitcase episode, phone episode, I mean, they are related to, let's say, the hippocampus. They are there, and they could be connected in terms of, let's say, having a taxi node. This is the taxi node, and this is the suitcase node. This is the cell phone node, and these pieces are also related to some other conceptual nodes. I mean, you know that kind of your cell phone is related to, let's say, some other, let's say, apps that you are using, some memory, some other pieces that are related to these components. So this could be something like a representational map of two different episodes that you experienced before. A recent episode that is your target, you are going to talk about this one, but you have other memories that could be competing to each other when you have the neocortical activation. So they would be sometimes even confused to each other. And when you do sometimes just a retrieval, so you just see a cap and you start to bring up your memories. What you have in your memory when you see this, let's say, cab, this cab is activating both your, let's say, suitcase episode and also your cell phone episode. But you are thinking more about, okay, the process of losing your cell phone. So you try to kind of increase the connections between these pieces here in your network. But when you do what they call a restudying, you just start to kind of, let's say, read a report about your experience before with cell phone and cab, and you activate just this part. So it is not a full retrieval process. It's just going to the specific report about the cell phone and the cab and trying to kind of evaluate the situation related to that. You are not retrieving the entire stories related to cab. So you just activate this part of the map. And overall, the claim that this paper is making, I'm not fully with this claim right now, but the claim that they are making is that if it is the case, when we retrieve the full episode of those experiences, over the time, they can get separated from each other. But when we just restudy them, they can still be connected to each other. And that is something that people are discussing about. Another kind of important field in terms of what we call retrieval. About when you learn a new topic, when you start to review the topic and you just try to retrieve every single part of the information that is related to that specific event, you are retrieving that kind of the complete map. And when you retrieve the complete map, you have this opportunity to be able to differentiate the map to different pieces. But when you just try to restudy a specific topic, you just activate the smaller maps, and these smaller maps would not have this opportunity to be able to differentiate concepts in the cortical level. But in reality, most of the students prefer to restudy, because when you want to, let's say, learn a specific lesson, a specific, let's say, textbook, you can spend 10 hours and read that, and then you can spend something like 1 day after 1 hour to review that, another 1 hour to review that. Compared to, let's say, spending 10 hours and learning the textbook, and then waiting for something like, let's say, 2-3 weeks, and then re-study the entire book for something like another 10 hours or 8 hours. And the question is, which one is going to be more effective, re-studying or repeated reviewing of the concept? But people realize that most of the students, they annoy or they avoid using the review process compared to the re-study process. So people most of the time, they just prefer to re-study things instead of reviewing things. And there are potential kind of reasons behind that. It seems that when we review things, just few days after when we learn something, it is going to be really energy demanding. So most of the students, when they learn something, they do not spend time, something like 1 day, 2 days after, to just review whatever they have learned. Because people realize that is going to be really energy demanding when you want to open up the entire representational space and activate all those maps that you have learned before. It seems that something like in an implicit way or an unconscious way, your brain is more interested to let you forget those pieces, and then you restart to just do the study again and make a new map. So you are not needed to reactivate all the map that you had from kind of your past study episode. And there are discussions in terms of why this is happening, but it is quite an interesting experience in terms of people realize that people prefer to re-study compared to review. But the final outcome of review of something like 12 hours, 10 hours plus 1 hours of review is going to be way higher in terms of making a, let's say, clear memory. This is what you have here is a better type of memory compared to this that you have here. Because it seems that in the review process, we are able to, over time, differentiate different maps in the cortical level that are going to be a better quality memory compared to the time that we have just re-studying everything again without having this opportunity to differentiate those pieces in the review process in the cortical level. So that is another interesting thing in terms of the, let's say, mental representation and memory retrieval and how these pieces are working together. I was interested to discuss about in terms of the priming and what does priming mean in the context that we have been discussing to just kind of complete this part of the session. Let me just kind of give you a really simple example of a sort of a priming task. So in the priming task, we just give you, let's say, the initial part of a word, and we ask you how many words you can make from this initial part. Go ahead, please. Just tell me how many words you can make with MET. This is called priming. So when I give you this initial part of the word, I'm activating one part of a network that is going to make the metal or meeting or whatever. And that network could get activated when I kind of turn on one part of the word. So it is called a sort of a perceptual priming. Okay, because we have been discussing about the kind of a sort of kind of initial stimuli that is activating some other processes in the brain. But here we have been discussing about addiction. And when we are talking about addiction, I was activating your conceptual frameworks related to anything related to addiction. And when I was asking this question, I saw that the first answer that came out was methadone. So that is called conceptual priming. So it is something like conceptual priming combined with perceptual priming, because I basically activated your conceptual map related to addiction, and then when I give you a cue, you have this word coming out. So this is called priming. So priming is a sort of memory. So it is basically a sort of memory that is related to neocortex. And it is about the maps that we have, or representational maps from concepts that we have in the neocortex. And when we do priming, if I go back to the slides that I show you in terms of the anatomy of these activations, when we talk about priming, we need neocortex for priming. We need just cortex. There is no need to hippocampus. So without hippocampus, you still have priming. So if I give you this task, without hippocampus, you can still retrieve, you can still kind of respond to this task. So that's an interesting part. Even without any sort of activation in hippocampus, you can still have the priming effect. So that is going to be another, let's say, dimension of what we have been discussing about today. Okay, so this part we discussed about some sort of complex concept in terms of what is a schema, how schema is being processed in the brain, how schemas are related to memory, and then we discussed about retrieval, and then we discussed about priming. Priming, we basically activate some cortical maps that are represented in cortex in terms of some perceptual modalities, or in the level of conceptual kind of understanding about different concepts. And those maps that are getting activated when we have one specific cue on that map, it could kind of bring up specific concepts or specific kind of perceptions related to that specific cue, and then we call that priming. And then there are many kind of examples of priming. But the most important part about priming is that priming is a type of memory, but it is a type of memory that is not related very much to hippocampus. So those who have damage to hippocampus, they can still have priming. That's an interesting part that I was interested to discuss about, to give you a better idea about what does that neocortical map or representational map mean.